My wife was hospitalized on a Tuesday in February. The event was sudden in the form that the sudden events are. Not the expected form, the specific form of the arriving without announcement. She was in the hospital by noon, and I had been there with her through the afternoon and into the evening. At 8 in the evening, I stepped into the hallway to call her mother. Her brother called me before I reached her mother. His name is Carlos. He is 30 years old. He said, "I know where you are." He said, "I know what is happening." He said, "Isabel asked me to do something if she was ever hospitalized." He said, "She asked me 5 years ago." He said, "She wrote something down and gave it to me in a sealed envelope." He said, "She said to read it to you if she was ever hospitalized." He said, "I want to ask you if you want to receive it now or if you want to wait." I said, "Now." I want to say something about the form of the receiving in the hospital hallway and about what the hallway had been in the form of the receiving the significant thing. The hospital hallway at 8 in the evening had been in the specific form of the hospital hallway. The specific light, the specific form of the people moving through the hallway in the forms that hospital hallways produce. The attending physicians, the family members in the specific quality of the family member in the hospital form, the orderlies. I had been in the hallway in the form of the husband in the hospital form. The husband in the hospital form had been the form I had been in since noon. Carlos had been on the phone in the form of the person who had been waiting for this form for 5 years. He had said, "I want to read you what she wrote." He had read it to me in the hospital hallway. I had been in the hallway receiving the thing she had written 5 years ago for this specific occasion. The specific occasion had arrived. The thing she had written had arrived through Carlos. The hallway had held both. I am a hydrogeologist. I have been working for 6 years at an environmental consulting firm in Richmond, Virginia, where I study the movement of groundwater through the aquifer systems, the specific work of understanding how the water moves below the surface, where it is stored, how it is recharged, how it can be accessed, and how the human activities affect the aquifer's function. My work requires the specific attention to what is below, the water that is not visible at the surface, but that is real and significant and determining the form of the landscape and the communities above. I had been doing this work for 6 years. The Carlos call had arrived in me in the professional language. Isabel had drilled the artesian well 5 years ago. The confined aquifer had been under pressure the whole time. The hospitalization had been the drilling event. The water had risen to the surface under its own pressure. I had been in the hallway when the water rose. I want to say something about Isabel and about who she had been in the form I had known her across the 5 years of the marriage and the 2 before that, and about what the Carlos call had given me for the fuller picture. She is 33 years old. She is a landscape architect in Richmond. She had been, in the form I had known her, the specific form of the person who expressed the love in the form of the doing, the specific acts that were organized around the other person's form, the particular coffee in the morning, the specific form of the attending to the things I had said I needed without my having to say them again. She had been warm and present and in the active form of the love. She had not been in the verbal form of the love, the naming form, the saying in the direct form. She had not said in the direct form the specific interior things. She had been in the active form. The Carlos call had told me. 5 years ago, she had written the specific interior things and had given them to her brother in the sealed envelope for the specific occasion. The sealed envelope and the active form had both been her form simultaneously. Both had been real. Both had been the love. Before I go on, if something in this story is landing close to something real in your life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. My name is Lucas. I am 36 years old. I am a hydrogeologist in Richmond, Virginia. And this is the story of the hospital hallway and the Carlos call, and what Isabel had written 5 years ago, and what the years since the hospitalization has been building, and what I understand now about the form of the person who writes the thing 5 years before the occasion, because they know they are in the form that may not give the thing in the ordinary form. I want to say something about the fuller account of the Carlos call, and about what he had said before he had read the letter, and about the specific form of the saying. He had said, "I want to tell you something about when Isabel gave me the envelope." He had said, "She gave it to me in the spring 5 years ago." He had said, The spring 5 years ago had been 3 months after you were married. He had said. She called me and asked me to come to the Richmond apartment. He had said. She had the envelope ready. He had said. She gave it to me and she said, if I am ever in the hospital and it is not clear what the outcome will be, I want you to read this to Lucas. She had said to him, do not open it until the occasion. She had said, if the occasion never arrives, keep it and eventually give it to him. He had said, I have had it in my desk drawer for 5 years. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to tell you something about having it in the desk drawer for 5 years. He had said, the having it in the drawer produced the form of the person who knows there is something that belongs to you and who is keeping it until the occasion. He had said, the occasion arrived today. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to read it to you. I had said yes. He had said yes. I want to say something about the hydrogeology parallel and about what the confined aquifer had given me for understanding the 5 years of the waiting. In hydrogeology, the confined aquifer is the aquifer that is bounded above by the confining layer, the impermeable rock or clay that prevents the direct recharge from the surface and maintains the water in the aquifer under pressure. The confined aquifer is under artesian pressure. The water in the aquifer is at a higher pressure than the atmospheric pressure. When a well is drilled through the confining layer into the confined aquifer, the water rises in the well, or flows out of the well entirely, under its own pressure. The water does not need to be pumped. The pressure drives the water to the surface when the path is opened. Isabel's interior form had been the confined aquifer. The specific things she had written had been under pressure in the confined form for 5 years. The confining layer had been the ordinary form, the warm and active form that had been the surface expression. The Carlos envelope had been the artesian well, the path opened through the confining layer. The water had risen to the surface in the hospital hallway under its own pressure. The pressure had been there for 5 years. I want to say something about the specific form of what Carlos had read, and about what the reading had given me in the form of the receiving in the hospital hallway. He had read it in the form of the person who had been holding the sealed thing for 5 years, and who was now in the reading form. His voice had been in the specific form of the person who was reading the significant thing to the person it was written for. I will not tell you everything she had written. The letter is hers, and it is mine. What I will tell you is the form of the letter. The letter had been written in 3 parts. The first part had been the specific things she had been grateful for across the marriage and the relationship before the marriage. Not the general form of the gratitude, the specific form. She had named specific things. The specific things had been the specific form of the grateful that the active form had been expressing and that the direct form had not been giving. The second part had been the specific form of who she had understood me to be across the 7 years. The specific qualities she had been watching. Not the complimenting form, the observing form. The third part had been a specific instruction. The instruction had been, keep building the life. The instruction had been given in the form of the person who did not know what the outcome of the occasion would be, and who wanted the future to have the instruction. I want to say something about the hydrogeology concept of the recharge zone, and what the recharge zone had given me for understanding where the letter had come from, and what had produced it. In hydrogeology, the recharge zone is the specific area of the landscape where the precipitation and the surface water enter the ground and percolate down to the aquifer. The zone where the confining layer is absent or thin, and the water can enter the confined aquifer. The recharge zone is often located at the higher elevation, at the edge of the basin, at the specific geological feature where the aquifer is exposed. The water enters at the recharge zone and flows through the aquifer toward the discharge zone under the pressure gradient. The spring 5 years ago had been the recharge event. Isabel had been at the specific moment, 3 months into the marriage, the specific form of the early marriage that produces the specific understanding of the person you have chosen, and the specific understanding had entered the aquifer. The understanding had been the water entering the recharge zone. The aquifer had been the interior form. The water had been accumulating under pressure since the spring of the marriage's first year. The Carlos envelope had been the discharge zone. The hospital had been the occasion that opened the discharge. I want to say something about the form of being in the hospital hallway receiving the Carlos call, and about the specific quality of the receiving. She had been in the room behind me, and I had been in the hallway with the phone. The room behind me had been the room with the doctors, and the uncertainty form. The phone had been the room with the 5-year-old letter. Both forms had been present simultaneously in the hallway. The uncertainty form behind me, and the 5-year-old letter in the phone. Both had been real. Both had been in the hallway at the same time. I had been receiving both simultaneously. The receiving of both simultaneously had been the specific form of the hospital hallway, the form in which the present difficulty and the past certainty were both present. The past certainty had been the letter, the 5-year-old certainty that she had written about the specific things she was grateful for, and the specific form of who I was. The past certainty had been real and had not been reduced by the present difficulty. Both had been in the hallway. The hallway had held both. I had been in the hallway holding both. The holding of both was the form. The form was good. I want to say something about returning to the room after the Carlos call, and about what the returning had been. I had been in the hallway for 20 minutes. I had received the letter. I had been in the form of the person who had received the significant thing, and who was returning to the room with the significant thing. She had been in the room in the form she had been in since noon. The specific form of the person who is in the hospital form, and who is in the specific quality of the person who is in the uncertain outcome form. I had returned to the room with the 20 minutes and the Carlos call, and the 3 parts of the letter in the background. She had looked at me when I had come back. She had been in the form of the person who had not expected the specific form I was in when I came back. She had said, "You look different." I had said, "Your brother called." She had been quiet. She had been quiet for a long time. She had said, "I gave him the envelope." I had said, "Yes." She had been quiet. She had said, "He read it." I had said, "Yes." She had been quiet. She had said, "I did not know if the occasion would arrive." I had said, "It arrived." She had been quiet. She had said, "Yes." Both of us had been quiet. The room had held both of us with the letter between us. I want to say something about the hydrogeology research I had been doing in the winter of the hospitalization year, and about what the research had been in conversation with the February and the months since. I had been working on the aquifer vulnerability assessment for a large agricultural region in the Virginia coastal plain. The specific form of the hydrogeology work that examines the vulnerability of the confined aquifer to the surface contamination, the specific places where the confining layer is thin or absent, and the aquifer is most at risk of the downward migration of the contaminants. The vulnerability assessment had been producing the specific map, the high vulnerability zones where the confining layer was absent, the low vulnerability zones where the confining layer was thick, the specific spatial pattern of the vulnerability across the region. I had been doing the vulnerability assessment with the February hospitalization in the background of the work. Both had been the assessment of the confined form, the aquifer's confining layer, and Isabel's specific form. The assessment had been producing the map of where the confined water could be reached. The February had been the location of the access point, where the confined form had been reached. The access had been the Carlos call. The access had been good. I want to say something about what had happened in the days after the hospitalization, when Isabel had been recovering, and about the form the recovery had taken. She had been in the hospital for 3 days. I had been in the hospital across the 3 days, in the form of the husband who was present. She had recovered in the specific form that the recovery takes when the event had been sudden and serious, and had resolved. The resolved form had produced the specific quality of the after, the form of the being alive and not in the form anymore that the surviving form produces. I had been with her in the resolved form across the 3 days. The Carlos call and the letter had been in the background of the 3 days. Neither of us had spoken about the letter in the 3 days. The letter had been between us in the way that the significant thing between two people is between them when both know about it, and neither has spoken about it. The between form had been in the room across the 3 days. Both had been in the room with the between form. The between form had been waiting for the form for the speaking. I want to say something about the conversation about the letter that had happened on the Sunday after she had come home from the hospital. She had been in the Richmond apartment in the recovered form, the specific form of the person who has been through the significant event and who has arrived at the other side of the event in the living form. I had been in the apartment with her on the Sunday. She had said, "I want to talk about the letter." I had said, "Yes." She had said, "I want to tell you why I wrote it." She had said, "I wrote it in the spring of the first year of the marriage." She had said, The spring of the first year of the marriage is the form in which both people understand what they have chosen. She had said, I understood what I had chosen in the spring of the first year. She had been quiet. She had said, I want to tell you what I understood. She had said, I understood that I was in the form of the person whose love form was the active form rather than the verbal form. She had said, the active form gives without saying. She had said, I wanted to make sure the saying arrived if the giving form was ever interrupted. She had been quiet. She had said, the hospital is the interrupting form. She had said, I wanted the saying to arrive in the interrupting form. I had said, it arrived. She had said, yes. Both of us had been quiet. The saying had arrived. The arriving had been good. I want to say something about what she had said about the specific things she had written in the first part, and about why she had written the specific things rather than the general form. She had said, I want to tell you about the specific things I wrote. She had said, I wrote the specific things because the general form does not arrive. She had said, the general form is, I am grateful for everything. She had said, the general form is true, and it does not arrive in the way the specific arrives. She had said, the specific is the form that says, I am grateful for the specific Tuesday in the specific form in the specific year. She had been quiet. She had said, I want to give you the specific now. She had said, I want to give you the verbal form of the specific in the direct form. She had been quiet. She had said, not all of it. The letter gives some of it. She had said, I want to give you the rest in the direct form. She had been quiet. She had said, the letter was written when I did not have the direct form available. She had said, I have the direct form available now. She had been quiet. She had said, the hospital gave me the direct form by showing me what the occasion looks like. She had been quiet. She had said, the occasion is not something I want to wait for to give the direct form. She had been quiet. She had said, I am giving it now. I had said yes. She had said yes. The now was the form. The now had arrived. I want to say something about what Carlos had said when I had called him after the Sunday conversation, and about the form of the exchange. He had answered and I had said, she is home. He had said, yes, I know. He had said, I want to ask you something about the letter. He had said, I want to ask you how it arrived. I had said, it arrived in the form she intended. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to tell you something about the 5 years of the holding. He had said, the 5 years of the holding had been the form of the person who knows that something belongs to someone and who is holding it in the correct form until the occasion. He had said, I have been careful with the envelope for 5 years. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to tell you something about what the careful holding required. He had said, the careful holding required the form of the person who believes the occasion will eventually arrive and who does not give the thing before the occasion. He had said, I was tempted twice in 5 years to give it to you before the occasion. He had been quiet. He had said, once when you bought the house and once when she was very ill the year before last, but it had resolved before I had acted. He had been quiet. He had said, the house was not the occasion. He had said, last year had not been the occasion. He had said, February was the occasion. I had said yes. He had said yes. The occasion had been February. I want to say something about the hydrogeology concept of the artesian pressure and what the artesian pressure had given me for understanding what had been building in the confined aquifer across the 5 years. In hydrogeology, the artesian pressure is the pressure under which the water in the confined aquifer is held. The pressure that is greater than the atmospheric pressure, that is produced by the weight of the water in the recharge zone at the higher elevation pressing down through the aquifer toward the discharge zone. The artesian pressure is not produced by the aquifer itself. The pressure is produced by the difference in elevation between the recharge zone and the discharge zone. The higher the recharge zone relative to the discharge zone, the higher the artesian pressure. The spring of the first year of the marriage had been the high recharge zone. The specific form of the new marriage and the specific understanding she had arrived at had entered the aquifer at a high elevation. The confined pressure had been building since the spring. The 5 years had been the building of the artesian pressure. The February had been the opening of the well. The artesian water had risen to the surface under the 5 years of the accumulated pressure. The artesian water had been the letter. The artesian pressure had been the 5 years of the love in the confined form. I want to say something about what Isabel had told me about the form of the writing the letter and about the specific form the writing had taken. She had said in June, for months after the hospital. I want to tell you about the writing of the letter. She had said, I wrote the letter on a Sunday afternoon in the spring. She had said, I wrote it in one sitting. She had said, I wrote it in the form of the person who had understood something and who needed to give the understanding the form it required. She had said, the form it required was the specific form rather than the general. She had been quiet. She had said, I want to tell you what I had understood that Sunday. She had said, I had understood that the form of the love I was in was the form that gave everything except the specific verbal form. She had said, the active form was giving constantly. She had been quiet. She had said, the active form gives the coffee in the morning and the reorganizing of the plans when the plans need reorganizing and the specific quality of the presence. She had said, the active form does not give the naming of the specific things. She had been quiet. She had said, I understood on the Sunday that the naming was mine to give and that I was not in the form that gave the naming in the ordinary form. She had said, I wrote the letter because I wanted the naming to have the form it needed. She had been quiet. She had said, the letter was the naming in the form it needed. I had said yes. She had said yes. The naming had been in the letter. The letter had arrived. I want to say something about the hydrogeology concept of the aquifer storage and what the storage had given me for understanding the 5 years and what the 5 years had produced. In hydrogeology, the aquifer storage is the specific property of the aquifer that describes how much water the aquifer can hold, the specific volume of the water that the aquifer can release per unit of head decline. The storage coefficient is the measure of the aquifer's capacity to accumulate and release the water. A high storage coefficient means the aquifer can hold a large volume of water and release it slowly across the long time. A low storage coefficient means the aquifer releases water rapidly with a small decline in the head. The confined aquifer has a low storage coefficient compared to the unconfined aquifer. The confined aquifer releases the water under the artesian pressure quickly when the well is opened. The 5-year letter had been the high storage form. The naming had been accumulating in a confined form for 5 years and had been released quickly when the February well had been opened. All 5 years in a single hospital hallway phone call. The 5 years in 20 minutes of the Carlos reading. The accumulated storage had been released in the full form in the 20 minutes. The storage had been good. The release had been good. I want to say something about what the year since February had been building in the form of the relationship between Isabel and me, and about what the building had been producing. The year had been the form of the year after the significant event, the specific quality of the being in the life, with the event in the background. The event had been the hospitalization and the Carlos call and the letter. All three had been in the background of the year. The year had been building something specific. The form of the verbal form arriving in the ordinary form. Isabel had said in March that she was giving the direct form now. She had been giving it. The giving had not been the dramatic form. The giving had been the specific quiet giving that had been arriving in the ordinary occasions since February. The March and the April and the May had each had the specific quiet giving in them. The Tuesday morning and the Sunday afternoon and the specific occasions had had the verbal form in them in the form that the active form had always had. The active form had continued. The verbal form had been added to the active form. Both forms had been in the same year. The both forms had been better than either alone. The year had been good in the both forms. I want to say something about the most significant thing Isabel had said in the year since February, and about when she had said it. She had said it in October, 8 months after the hospital. She had said, I want to tell you something about the letter and about what the letter gave me. She had said, the letter gave me the form of the knowing that the naming had arrived. She had been quiet. She had said, the active form does not know if the receiving has the naming in it. She had said, the active form gives but does not know if the receiving has the specific things in the named form. She had said, the Carlos call told me you had the naming in the named form. She had been quiet. She had said, I want to tell you what the knowing produced. She had said, the knowing that you had the naming in the named form produced the form of the being known in the specific form. She had said, the being known in the specific form is the form that the active form builds toward without knowing if it has arrived. She had been quiet. She had said, The hospital produced the knowing that it had arrived. She had been quiet. She had said, I want you to know the active form has been building toward the being known in the specific form. She had said, the hospital told me the being known had arrived. I had said yes. She had said yes. The being known had arrived. The arriving had been the February. The February had been good. I want to say something about the hydrogeology research, and about what the year since February had given the research. The aquifer vulnerability assessment had been the form of the professional work for 6 years. The research had been good. The February year had given me the inside understanding of the confined aquifer as the form that holds the significant thing under pressure and releases it when the occasion opens the path. The professional aquifer and the interior letter had both been the confined form. Both had been under the confining layer. Both had been under the pressure of the accumulated weight. Both had been waiting for the specific occasion that opened the path. The occasion for the professional aquifer was the well drilling. The occasion for the interior letter had been the February hospitalization. Both had been the path opened through the confining layer. The path opened had released the thing under pressure. The thing under pressure had arrived at the surface. The surface had been the hospital hallway and the Carlos phone. The arrival had been the naming. The naming had been good. The professional understanding and the personal year had been the same form of the work. Both had been good. The year had been good in both forms. I want to say something about a Sunday call with Carlos in August, and about what the call had been in the form the months had built. He had called at noon in the established form. The regular contact that had been building since the February call. The February call had been the first in the specific form call between Carlos and me. The call since had been the building of the contact in the new form. He had been telling me about the week in Charlottesville where he was finishing his law degree. Near the end he had said, I want to tell you something about the envelope and about the 5 years. He had said, I held the envelope for 5 years without fully understanding what I was holding. He had been quiet. He had said, I understood what I was holding on the Tuesday when Isabel was hospitalized. He had said, I understood that I was holding the thing that would arrive when the occasion arrived. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to tell you what the understanding on the Tuesday produced. He had said, the understanding produced the clarity about the reading. He had said, I had no difficulty reading it. He had said, I had expected it to be difficult to read a letter written for this occasion. He had said, it was not difficult. He had said, the letter was the form that was ready to be read. He had been quiet. He had said, the letter read itself. I had said yes. He had said yes. The letter had read itself. The readiness had been good. I want to say something about the most recent Sunday, and about what the Sunday had been in the form the year had arrived at. Isabel had been at the drafting table in the study in the landscape architect form. The Sunday morning with the project drawings and the specific quality of the concentration that the drawing form produces in her. I had been in the kitchen with the hydrogeology field data. Both had been in the Richmond apartment in the form the year had built. Near the end of the morning, she had come to the kitchen in the specific form of the person who has been in the work and who has arrived at the giving the verbal form moment. She had said, I want to tell you something. I had turned from the data. She had said, I have been in the project this morning. She had said, the project is the specific form of the project that I am most fully myself in. She had said, I want you to know I am most fully myself in this form. She had been quiet. She had said, the letter said it. She had said, I want to also say it. I had said yes. She had said yes. The letter had said it. The direct form had also said it. Both had said it. The both said was the fuller form. The fuller form was the form. The form was good. Both of us were in it. The Sunday was good. I want to say something about what the year has given me for the hydrogeology practice, and about what the inside understanding has added to the professional form. The confined aquifer work had been the form of the professional practice for 6 years. The work had been good. The February year had given me the inside understanding of the confined form as the form that holds the real thing under pressure, and that is not the absence of the thing, but the confined presence of the thing. The aquifer does not tell you what is below. The aquifer is below telling itself. The confining layer does not mean the absence of the water. The confining layer means the water is under pressure below. The knowing of the confined form from the inside. The knowing that the pressure is real and the water is real and the confining layer is the form rather than the absence had changed the professional receiving of the confined aquifer data. I had been reading the aquifer data for 6 years in the form of a scientist who found the pressure dynamics interesting. The February year had given me the inside form of the pressure as the thing the confined form produces while it waits for the right occasion to open. The right occasion and the right path had both been required. Both had arrived in February. The water had risen. The water was good. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story connected with something real in your life, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you are in the active form, the form that gives constantly through the doing, and that does not give the naming in the ordinary daily form, I want to say something clearly before you go. The naming is yours to give. The active form builds toward the being known in the specific form. The being known in the specific form requires the naming. You do not have to write the letter and give it to your brother. You can give the naming in the ordinary form. The ordinary form is available. The Tuesday morning and the Sunday afternoon are the ordinary form. The naming in the ordinary form is better than the naming in the hospital hallway. Give the naming in the ordinary form. The ordinary Tuesday is the form. The form is available now. Give it now. I want to say something about the specific form of the first part of the letter and about the specific things she had named and about what the naming had given me in the form of the receiving. Carlos had read the specific things in the naming form, the specific occasions she had named, the specific forms she had been grateful for in the specific form. Not, you are supportive. The specific Tuesday in the second year of the marriage, when she had been in the difficult form of the project deadline, and he had reorganized the week in the specific way that had allowed her to finish. She had named the specific Tuesday. The specific Tuesday had been in the letter. I had received the specific Tuesday in the hospital hallway as the thing she had been grateful for that had been in the named form for 5 years. I had been in the specific Tuesday in the second year without knowing the specific Tuesday had been named and held. Both had been real simultaneously. The specific Tuesday had been ordinary, and the specific Tuesday had been named in the 5-year-old letter. The ordinary and named form had been the both simultaneously. The both had arrived in the hallway. The hallway had received the both. Both were real. Both were good. I want to say something about the hydrogeology concept of the potentiometric surface, and what the potentiometric surface had given me for understanding the form of the 5 years, and what the 5 years had been building. In hydrogeology, the potentiometric surface is the imaginary surface that represents the level to which the water in the confined aquifer would rise if the confining layer were removed. The surface that shows the pressure distribution across the confined aquifer. The potentiometric surface tells you where the artesian pressure would produce the artesian flow if the confining layer were absent. The potentiometric surface had been rising across the 5 years. The specific things she had been grateful for in the specific Tuesdays and Sundays and ordinary occasions had each been the recharge event that had raised the potentiometric surface. Each specific thing she had been attending to had been the recharge. The 5 years of the attending had been the 5 years of the potentiometric surface rising. The February had been the point at which the potentiometric surface had broken through the confining layer. The breaking through had been the Carlos call. The water had risen to the hallway level. The hallway had been the discharge point. The discharge had been the naming. I want to say something about what my mother had said when I had called her after the hospital and had told her about the Carlos call. Her name is Rosa. She is 62 years old. She had answered, and I had told her the account of the Tuesday, and the hospitalization, and the Carlos call. She had been very quiet. She had said, I want to tell you what Isabel did. She had said, Isabel prepared for the occasion. She had said, the preparing for the occasion is the form of the person who knows the specific thing needs to be given and who does not know when the occasion will arrive. She had said, the person who knows the specific thing needs to be given and who prepares the form of the giving before the occasion is in the specific form. She had said, not everyone is in that form. She had been quiet. She had said, most people wait for the occasion and then find they do not have the form for the giving. She had said, Isabel did not wait. She had said, Isabel prepared the form 3 months into the marriage. She had been quiet. She had said, the preparing 3 months into the marriage tells you. She was in the giving form since the beginning. She had been quiet. She had said, not the giving form that waited for the occasion. She had said, the giving form that prepared for the occasion while it was still only the spring. I had said yes. She had said yes. The preparing in the spring was the form. The form was hers since the spring. I want to say something about what the third part of the letter had contained, the specific instruction, and about what the instruction had meant in the form it had arrived in. Carlos had read, keep building a life. That had been the instruction. 3 words. He had read them in the hospital hallway, and I had been in the form of the person receiving the instruction in the specific form of the instruction. The instruction given by the person who was in the uncertain outcome form to the person who would be in the life regardless of the outcome. The 3 words had contained a full instruction. Keep building the life. Each word had been the form. Keep was the continuation form. Building was the active form. The life was the specific form rather than the general. The life was not a life, the specific life, the life being built by both of them together in the Richmond apartment, and the specific Tuesdays, and the specific landscape projects, and the specific groundwater assessments, and the specific form of the U.S. The instruction had been, keep the specific life that is being built. The 3 words had contained the full instruction. I had received the 3 words in the hallway in the form they had required. The 3 words had been good. The receiving had been good. I want to say something about Carlos, and about what the 5 years of the holding had given him beyond the holding itself. He had said in August, I want to tell you something about what the 5 years gave me that the giving alone could not have given. He had said, the 5 years gave me the form of the person who carries the significant thing with care across the long time. He had said, I am a law student. He had said, the law is the form of the person who understands that the significant thing requires the careful carrying. He had said, the envelope was my education in the careful carrying before I began the formal education in the careful carrying. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to tell you something about what the careful carrying of the envelope taught me. He had said, the careful carrying taught me. The significant thing does not change form when it is held correctly. He had said, the letter was the same letter on the Tuesday when I read it that it had been on the Sunday 5 years ago when Isabel gave it to me. He had said, the careful holding had preserved it in the same form. He had said, the thing that is held correctly does not degrade. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to apply that to the law. He had been quiet. He had said, I have been thinking about the careful holding since the February. I had said yes. He had said yes. The careful holding was the form. The form was good. I want to say something about Isabel and about what the year since February had given her in the form of the changed relationship with the naming form. She had said in July, I want to tell you something about what has changed since February. She had said, the February produced the form of the naming as available. She had said, I had understood before February that the naming was available in the occasion form, the hospital form, the occasion form. She had said, I had not understood that the naming was available in the ordinary form. She had said, the Tuesday morning is the ordinary form. She had said, the February showed me. The naming does not require the occasion. She had said, the naming is available in the Tuesday morning. She had been quiet. She had said, I want to tell you what has changed since the February. She had said, I have been giving the naming in the Tuesday morning since February. She had said, not every Tuesday. She had said, the Tuesdays when the naming has the form it needs to be given. She had been quiet. She had said, the Tuesdays when the naming has the form it needs to be given are the Tuesdays I have been attending to since February. She had said, I have been attending to the naming form since February. She had been quiet. She had said, the attending is the form I have now. I had said yes. She had said yes. The attending to the naming form had been her form since February. The form was good. I want to say something about the research I had been doing in the spring after the February hospitalization and about what the research had been in conversation with the year. I had been working on the delineation of the wellhead protection areas for the confined aquifer in the coastal plain, the specific form of the hydrogeology work that identifies the zone from which the recharge to a specific well travels across the aquifer. The wellhead protection area is the area that must be protected from the contamination to ensure the quality of the well water, the area that is the effective recharge zone for the specific well. The wellhead protection delineation had been producing the specific maps across the spring, the specific areas of land that were connected to the specific wells through the aquifer flow paths. I had been delineating the connection between the recharge zone and the discharge zone, with the February hospitalization in the background. Both had been the tracing of the connection between the recharge and the discharge. The professional form traced the connection through the aquifer geometry, and the personal year traced the connection between the spring of the first marriage year and the February hallway. Both had been the same form of the work. The tracing had been good in both forms. The connection was real in both. I want to say something about what the specific things in the second part of the letter had given me, and about what the second part had been in the form of the receiving. The second part had been the specific form of who she had understood me to be across the 7 years. Carlos had read the specific form, the specific qualities she had been observing. She had observed the specific quality of the attending form I had been in across the 7 years, the specific form of the attending in the geology fieldwork and the attending in the ordinary life. She had observed the attending without knowing I had been receiving her attending simultaneously. Both had been attending to each other's attending across 7 years, without either naming the attending to the other. The letter had named her attending to my attending. The naming had been the gift of the second part I had received. She had been observing the attending form in me across the 7 years. The observing had been real. The 7 years of the observing had been the 7 years of the attending to each other simultaneously in the non-naming form. The naming in the letter had been the first time the observing had been given the name. The name had arrived in the hospital hallway. The naming was good. I want to say something about a conversation I had with Isabel in April, 2 months after the hospital, in which she had said something about the form of the attending that I had been carrying since. She had said, "I want to tell you about the form of the attending in the active form." She had said, "The active form is the form of the attending expressed in the doing." She had said, "The attending in the active form attends to what the other person needs and does the thing the attending shows is needed." She had been quiet. She had said, "The attending in the naming form attends to what the other person is and names the attending." She had said, "Both forms of the attending are real." She had been quiet. She had said, "I have been in the active form of the attending." She had been quiet. She had said, "I have not been in the naming form of the attending in the ordinary daily form." She had said, "The letter was my way of giving the naming form when I did not have the ordinary daily form for it." She had been quiet. She had said, "I understand now that the naming form is available in the ordinary daily form." She had said, "The February showed me the naming form was available in the ordinary daily form." She had been quiet. She had said, "I have been in the naming form since February." She had said, "Not only the active form." She had said both. I had said yes. She had said yes. The both had been the form since February. The both was good. I want to say something about the hydrogeology concept of the discharge spring, and what the discharge spring had given me for understanding the form the letter had taken. In hydrogeology, the discharge spring is the natural emergence of the groundwater at the surface, the specific location where the confined or unconfined aquifer discharges the water to the surface through the geological feature, the fault, the contact between the geological units, the topographic low point. The discharge spring is the natural path through the confining layer. The geology has opened a path, and the water emerges under its own artesian pressure or gravity. The discharge spring is not the drilled well. The spring finds the path through the confining layer naturally. The letter had been the discharge spring, not the drilled well of the direct conversation, the natural path through the confining layer that the geology of Isabel's form had opened. The natural path had been the occasion, the sealed envelope, the brother. The three had been the discharge spring, the natural geology of the form producing the discharge in the form the geology had available. The artesian water had emerged through the natural path in the February. The emergence had been the naming in the hospital hallway. The naming through the natural path had been real. I want to say something about what had happened in the Richmond apartment in the first week after she had come home from the hospital, and about what the first week had been in the form of the recovering in the familiar space. She had been in the apartment in the form of the person who had been in the hospital and who was returning to the specific form of the established life. The apartment had been the established form. The specific form of the Richmond apartment, that had been the established life for the 5 years of the marriage. The drafting table in the study, the specific form of the kitchen in the morning, the specific quality of the afternoon light in the living room in February. All had been the established form. She had returned to the established form in the recovering body. Both had been present simultaneously. The established form of the apartment and the recovering form of the person returning to it. Both had been real. I had been in the apartment with both simultaneously. The receiving the established form with the new context of the Carlos call and the letter. The established form had been the same form it had always been. The context had been different. The different context had produced the different receiving of the same form. The same coffee in the morning and the same apartment had been received differently. The different receiving was good. I want to say something about what the most complete thing the February and the year had given me, and about the form the understanding had taken. The most complete thing had been, the active form builds a life, and the naming form names the life being built, and both are required for the full form of the love. I had been receiving the active form for 7 years. The active form had been building the life. The life had been being built. The building had been the specific Tuesdays, and the specific projects, and the specific quality of the present unattending. The building had been real and good, and the form I had received as the full form. The naming form had been in the sealed envelope for 5 years, while the building had been happening. The naming form had arrived in the February. After the February, the naming form had been arriving in the Tuesday mornings and the Sunday afternoons. The naming form and the active form had both been in the same life since February. The both forms in the same life was the fuller form. The fuller form was better than either alone. The February had given me the fuller form. The fuller form was the form. The form was good. Both of us were in it. The life being built was good. I want to say something about the wellhead protection mapping I had been doing in June, and about a specific finding that had been most in conversation with the year. The mapping had been showing the specific form of the connection between the recharge zone and the well, the flow path through the confined aquifer, the residence time in the aquifer, the specific area of the land surface that contributed the recharge to the specific well. One of the wells I had been mapping had had a very large wellhead protection area. The recharge zone had been distant, 12 miles, and the flow path through the aquifer had been long, 30 years of the travel time. The water at the well had entered the aquifer 30 years ago at the recharge zone 12 miles away. 30 years of travel through the aquifer had produced the water at the discharge point today. The specific Tuesday in the second year of the marriage had entered the recharge zone of the letter 5 years ago. The flow path had been 5 years. The water had arrived at the discharge point, the hospital hallway, in February. The recharge and the discharge had been separated by 5 years of the travel time. The travel time had been the 5 years of the held envelope. The water had been real at the recharge zone and real at the discharge point. Both had been the same water. I want to say one last thing about the 3 words in the third part of the letter, and about what the 3 words had been in the form the year has shown me. Keep building the life. The 3 words had been in the sealed envelope for 5 years, waiting for the occasion. The occasion had arrived. The 3 words had arrived with the occasion. The 3 words had contained the full form of the instruction and the full form of the trust. The trust had been, I trust you to keep building after whatever the occasion produces. The instruction had been, keep the building going. The 3 words had been written in the spring of the first year by the person who was 3 months into the marriage and who had understood the specific form of the building and who had wanted the building to be the instruction if the occasion arrived. The occasion had arrived in February. The instruction had arrived with the occasion. The keeping and the building had continued after February. The keeping and the building were continuing now. The now was good. The 3 words were good. Keep building the life. The life was good. Both of us were in it. The building was good. I want to say something about the most recent Sunday call with Carlos, and about what the call had been in the form the year had built. He had called at noon in the established form. We had been in the call for 35 minutes. He had been in the Charlottesville form, the law school form, the form of the person who was in the building of the professional form. Near the end he had said, I want to tell you something about how I think about the envelope now. He had said, I thought about the envelope for 5 years as the thing I was holding for Isabel to give you. He had said, I understand now that the envelope was not Isabel's gift to you alone. He had said, the envelope was Isabel's gift to the occasion. He had said, the occasion needed the gift and the gift needed the occasion, and both needed me to hold the connection between them for 5 years. He had said, I was the form that connected the gift to the occasion. He had been quiet. He had said, the connecting the gift to the occasion form is the form I want to be in as a lawyer. He had been quiet. He had said, the lawyer is the form that holds the significant thing in the correct form and gives it to the right occasion. He had said, the envelope was the education in the lawyer form before the lawyer education. I had said yes. He had said yes. The envelope had been his education. The education had been good. I want to say something about the hydrogeology work and about what the year has given the professional form of the attending to the confined aquifer. The aquifer vulnerability assessment and the wellhead protection mapping had been the form of the professional work for 6 years. The work had been good. The February year had given me the inside understanding of the confined aquifer as the form that holds the real thing under pressure, and that gives it when the right path is opened. The professional aquifer holds the water under pressure, and the water is real and significant and present below the confining layer. The personal year holds the named things under the confining layer of the ordinary form, and the named things are real and significant and present below the ordinary. Both had been the same form. The professional work and the personal year had been confirming each other from the different directions. The professional work, the water under the confining layer, is real. The personal year, the naming under the ordinary form, is real. Both real. Both confirmed. Both good. The year had been the confirmation of both. The confirmation was good. The form was good. Both of us were in it. I want to say something about the Richmond apartment in the most recent week, and about what the week had been in the form the year had produced. She had been in the study with the drafting table on the Tuesday. I had been in the study with the field data on the Wednesday. Both had been in the apartment in the separate work in the same space form. On the Thursday evening, she had come to the desk where I was working and had said, I want to tell you something about the project I finished this week. She had said, the project is the specific form I was telling you about on the Sunday. She had been quiet. She had said, I finished it in the form I wanted to finish it in. She had been quiet. She had said, I want you to know the form it arrived in. She had told me the specific form. I had received the specific form. Both had been in the Thursday evening in the Richmond apartment. The active form and the naming form had both been in the Thursday. The Thursday had held both. The Thursday had been good. The Richmond apartment had been good. The life being built had been good. The keeping had been happening. The building had been happening. Both were good. All of it was good.